Okay, good morning everyone joining on today's webinar. Good to see you. Gonna be kicking off shortly, but as always, just leave just a couple of minutes or so for allowing everyone to sort of join and get through the hoops, jump through the hoops against that we've had with GoTo. A bit of fun and games earlier in the week with regards to GoTo, but yeah, it's nice to see so many joining. Whilst we do that, it would be good to get familiar with the GoTo menu panel, perhaps, or you'll see there on the side there's a chat function. So yeah, please do, sort of post in the chat where you're joining us from today, maybe your organisation, your name, just to say hello and where you're joining us from. Our colleagues behind the scenes will be keeping an eye on the chat. But importantly, if there are questions, and I see somebody has potentially already sort of posted a question there, put something in there. Oh, great stuff. Hi Dan from Exeter. Yeah, good stuff. And yeah, we can use that. With regards to questions from those attending, we might not have time for them, but please do put them in there because we'd like to capture them anyway and respond to them if we can during the session. But as we start the session, I just thought I'd say a few words really, just to introduce what we're doing today and introduce Geovation as well. Yeah, my name's Luke. I'm the Geovation Innovation Manager, and Geovation is an initiative from Ordnance Survey. OS obviously are the mapping organisation that map Great Britain. And we use location and intelligence data to illuminate the unseen is the new advertising strapline actually. So it's all about helping people see a better place with three kind of key pillars in mind around sustainability, health, and then connecting places too. So today's topic is entirely relevant with regards to those three pillars I've mentioned there, in regard to creating and protecting green urban spaces. And we're well aligned with obviously Ordnance Survey with Geovation. Our mission really just to bring people together to unlock potential and address challenges and opportunities for a positive impact. We launched 2009, some 14 years ago, and one of our panelists here has been on board with Geovation from the start, but I'm going to give them a little bit more airtime in just a few minutes' time. But yeah, with regards to Geovation, we like to describe ourselves as the home of the geospatial startup ecosystem, but it's more than just startups that we support, and the ecosystem is the key word there really, because we've got around 2,000 in our community. It's around that sort of mark at the moment, and there's a nice kind of broad sort of spectrum of kind of people in the community, from startups through to corporates. There are government organisations. There are all sorts of people there that have an interest in kind of geospatial and property innovation. So, quick plug there. Really, it's free to join as a community member. Simply visit our website geovation.uk and look for the join link there. It's open to all. So we run 3 accelerator programs at Geovation, one in collaboration with the HM Land Registry, that's our PropTech accelerator. We also run one with the Registers of Scotland, which is the equivalent north of the border in Scotland. And of course, we then run our Geotech accelerator as well, which is the OS-backed accelerator. And we're all about, launching, helping startups to launch and grow around those areas. So around 150 startups that we've actively backed in that time. So that's the Geovation kind of introduction out the way. And basically, today we're here to obviously discuss the positive impact panel session that we've got today. And so I'm just going to read a bit of a background out now. So yeah, we're here to discuss some of the many subject areas linked with how we can better create and maintain urban green spaces in the UK. We're delighted to have us joined by a panel of industry experts, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves shortly. So open spaces like parks, playing fields, cemeteries, allotments and gardens compose a network of varying forms of green space that make up the fabric of our towns and cities. Combined with the blue features such as ponds, rivers and canals, then a network of wider environmental features emerge. Collectively, this network forms the urban green infrastructure that helps deliver countless benefits like clean air, enhancing biodiversity, improving our mental and health and physical well-being, and of course the social interaction that these spaces provide too. Yet, as more and more people move to urban areas, some projections predict that nearly 70% of the world's population is going to be living in towns and cities by the middle of the century. The demand for these services and demand for services increase. It places an even more pressure on our green infrastructure and those responsible for their provision and maintenance. Other changes, such as an aging population, increased energy and resource efficiency requirements, integration of smart technologies, and wider shifts in societal values are also thrown into the mix. And collectively, all these necessitate different forms of urban development and management, along with the promotion of urban green spaces and their benefits. So throughout this session, we're going to discuss the importance of urban green spaces, the challenges in their creation and protection, as well as potential ways of alleviating these. We hope today's session is going to spark meaningful conversation, foster collaboration and innovation, and ultimately inspire us to participate in ensuring our green spaces thrive and flourish. So there, without further ado, it's time to meet the panel, and I'm going to ask them each to just briefly introduce themselves, and starting in the top left-hand corner with Dr. Anna. Hi, Anna.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. So I'm Anna Barker, and I'm an Associate Professor in Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Leeds. And I'm currently leading research into women and girls' perceptions of safety in parks, and working with various partners to design guidance that will help make and support change in this area. So you're going to hear a lot of it from me about kind of gendered accessibility around parks and barriers in that regard. But I've also conducted research into the past, present and future of parks, and into research around charitable giving in parks. And in that regard, I'm also a trustee of Love Leeds Parks, which is part of the growing network of UK charitable parks foundations, which seek to support improvements to parks, foster engagement in nature through essentially enhancing voluntary donations, business support, working with communities and volunteers, and bringing different stakeholders together.
That's great. Thank you, Anna, and welcome. And over to you, John.
Okay. Sorry, hello. So my name is John Rose. I work for a company called Treeconomics as an urban forest consultant, and a lot of the work is with anybody who owns a vast number of trees, and in most cases that is local government entities or any large developer, landowner, and help them understand those trees in terms of their environmental benefits, but also their vulnerabilities, whether it's climate change or inherent vulnerabilities because of the structural nature of the population they've got. And then also planning for the future, helping them work out how they might take a more strategic route to managing those trees and planting new ones.
That's great. Thanks, John, and welcome. And Gillian, over to you. Oh, I think we're still on mute potentially, Gillian, or might be playing catch up, so please try again. Okay, nothing. Oh, what a shame. We did try testing early, didn't we? So still nothing, still unable. I wonder if maybe trying without the headphones, I'm not sure if that would make any difference.
I'm there now. I think I can't unmute because your folk at the back have muted me. So I think it's a technical bit. So they've unmuted me rather than me. So that's fine. So sorry, folks, for that, because I'm normally more technically astute than this. I'm Gillian Dick. I'm the Spatial Planning Manager, Research and Development at Glasgow City Council, which is within the Development Plan Group. I'm a town planner to trade. I'm proud to be a town planner to trade. I have responsibility for our open space strategy, working on our forest and woodland strategy, and place efficiency assessment, which just came into regulation in Scotland on Monday, 90 days before anybody challenges that. But that's challenging us to talk to the young people under 18 of all diversity, all gender, all ability, about the places that they play in formally and informally, i.e. it's a way of getting them to talk about place, because we're going to ask them to talk about the development plan at a later date. Just come off the back of 5 years on the Connecting Nature project, so that's Horizon 2020 funded, one of the first 5 that Europe funded to do nature-based solutions. We were the co-lead with the University of A Coruña on the impact assessment, produced a tool called co-impact.app, which asks you the the 5 criteria nature-based solutions, which I'll go into later. And I talk about taking a place-based approach, using nature-based solutions to create climate adaptive places. It's what planners have always done, and I'm reclaiming that ground because nobody knows. They think we process planning applications, and that's not what we do. That's a very small part of what we do. I'll stop there, and your control can mute me, and I'll let them unmute me when they want me to speak. I'm not touching anything anymore, which is going to mean that I'm silenced when you want to silence me.
Oh dear. Well, my apologies for that, Gillian. I'm sure we'll try and sort that out. Last but no means least, over to Dan. Just quickly, with Dan, obviously with our long history with Dan being, when we launched Geovation back in 2009 as a Geovation Challenge series, Dan was the winner of one of the winners of our inaugural Geovation Challenges. So Dan, over to you to introduce yourself, and also then maybe just to give a bit of a segue into the session that we're doing today around importance, barriers and innovations. If you just like to say a few words around that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be contributing to this important conversation. I'm a geographer. I'm a former geography teacher. I'm a National Geographic explorer, and I led the campaign that led to London becoming the world's first national park city. My work now is mainly working on a project called Slowways, which is this national initiative to create a network of walking routes that connect up all the towns and cities across Great Britain and to get more people out walking. And I don't know about any of you panelists and people who are listening as well, but when I was a kid, I absolutely loved getting outside to explore. I would find bits of tarpaulin and make dodgy rafts to cross rivers, and I'd get building rope to create death slides over streams. And I play a game where the plastic piping that I put through the rope would melt as I went down the death slide, and I'd try and see how far I could get over the river before I fell into the ground. And I love playing massive wide games as well, going into the woods with friends and playing giant games of hide and seek, which I was always especially good at because I was willing to get myself inside badger holes or get myself right up to the top of trees and to hide from other people. And I think that at that time, I felt that it was absolutely my right to have a relationship with nature in a super playful way, in a way that I wanted to have that relationship. And I think as I became older, I began to understand that, and especially when I started teaching geography, that actually it was more of a privilege that I had access to those spaces, that I had the parents that would allow me to have access to those spaces, and that I had the friendship groups and the permissions to enable me to go and enjoy that sort of relationship with nature. And where I am now is I'm sort of remembering really how important I think it is that we all have a right to nature. But in reality, when it comes to thinking about having a right to access to green space and to nature, for too many of us, it's just not possible at sufficient enough quality. And it's interesting, my relationship with OS that Luke referred to over the years. So actually, the very first challenge event that I entered with OS, where we won about $3 grand, was for a project called Mission Explore, which was all about creating a series of missions and micro challenges that challenge children to get outside and explore in creative ways. And actually, we were inspired by a graphic that came out of Sheffield that was in the Daily Mail, completely inspired by the Daily Mail, which showed over 3 generations the contraction of space in which people were allowed to play and explore in. And so we created these children's books about getting outside and playing more, with lots of activity ideas, but then entered Geovation as a way to think about how we could turn it into a geospatial app that could locate activities to specific woodlands and specific places, so that children and parents going outside could be inspired and invited to engage with those environments in different ways. And then further on into my relationship with Geovation, I started this campaign around making London a national park city. And really that was about amplifying and celebrating the importance of green space and nature and our connection to it in cities for our well-being, our health, thinking about flooding, thinking about climate, all the things that Julian's been talking about, and so much more. But how so often there are these barriers that actually prevent people from being able to access those benefits. And then thinking about how in the context of London and any of our great cities in Britain, actually in terms of solutions and innovation, we have many of the solutions and innovations we need to create significant change to people's lives. The problem is those solutions aren't being spread equitably or quickly enough across our cities. And part of my inspiration around the London National Park City was going on a walk from South London to North London through what's actually by UN standards technically a forest. It's a city of 15,000 species of wildlife. but the only children that I saw playing in the woods during the Easter school holidays were parents with children who were walking dogs. And it's like we have this understanding that dogs need to have access to nature and green spaces for their health and well-being. Yet when it comes to our children, for some reason, we don't seem to afford them the same freedoms quite often, which I think is a bit of a bizarre state of where we are in society at the moment. So I know that the conversation today is me sort of pivoting around these three key points, I guess. The importance of why it's so important that, from my point of view, we have a right to green space, to nature, and not just to any old bits of roundabout or scruffy ground that happens to have some dog turd on it, but high quality, safe, accessible green space and nature. Do we look at all the barriers that we can tear down, whether we're talking about safety in terms of soft barriers or physical barriers like physical obstructions, but also thinking about where are those solutions that already exist, and why is it that those solutions, like I've already said, aren't spreading quickly or equitably enough across our cities. And I think that the power of geography is to be able to understand the importance, understand the barriers, and understand the innovations in a geospatial way, in a way that can be strategic. So when we do scale them up and do allow them to spread, we're doing it in a way that's as effective as possible for the people who need it most.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dan. And that's really, really so true, everything you've said there. All right, I'm going to crack into the questions now, and starting on that importance, that first pillar that we're looking at, and around health and well-being specifically. So the question is, and then this one's for Anna first, if you'd like to address this one. So it's been suggested that investment in urban green infrastructure has been proposed as a cost-effective public health measure. In your opinion, how and why is that the case?
Well, following Dan there, I wholeheartedly agree that parks and green spaces need to be high quality and should be part of our natural health service. Though I would add, again, agreeing with Dan, that parks are amenity green spaces as part of this kind of wider network, and they do need to feel safe and welcoming to use. And I think without that, the positive effects on health and well-being aren't going to be fully realised. So it means designing high quality spaces, maintaining them to a high standard, which is really important to people's perceptions, because that will also drive use of space. Going to the kind of question about the question of cost effective, that the urban green infrastructure is a cost effective health measure. I think some of the panelists could also speak to this, that there have been obviously lots of innovative efforts in recent years to kind of quantify the worth of green spaces, and I think this work has already shown that parks and green spaces generate significant returns on investment, but also that there would be further cost savings if everyone had good access to accessible green space, as that would be driving use close to home. So I think it's relatively undisputed that green spaces deliver value for money, and the green infrastructure framework, obviously, that's just been released, have illustrated that this is 6.6 billion worth of benefits in health, climate change and environment per year. So essentially, the argument here is that parks and green spaces save money, but we do need to invest in parks and green spaces to realise and maximise those benefits. And I suppose what surprises me in this regard is that despite all of these financial valuations of the cost effectiveness and the kind of weight of research evidence on the benefits of green spaces, we still struggle to make an impression on the political perception of parks and green infrastructure as kind of essential infrastructure that needs kind of baseline funding. And obviously, in terms of parks, that sector's lost £690 million in the past decade, according to APSI. And obviously, parks continue as a discretionary service rather than as a statutory service for local authorities, meaning that there's no legal duty to provide and maintain parks to recognise high quality standards that we've been talking about that would reduce those barriers. So we kind of think back to, there was an inquiry by the House of Commons in 2017 into the future of parks and green spaces. And I think the kind of conclusions of that kind of speak to this question, which is, if you don't mind me quoting, so parks are at a tipping point, and failure to match their value and the contribution they make to the resources they need to be sustained could have severe consequences. And for me, those conclusions really were a cautionary warning, that essentially if we take green spaces for granted, we do so at our own peril, and they need resources to be sustained. But I think the question of investment in urban green infrastructure also goes to a deeper point from our research at Leeds, and it's this: it's that our legacy of public parks and green spaces offer benefits to communities that other uses of urban spaces can't. So this raises a question of what we do with and how we invest in the finite land that we have. So maintaining urban space as green space means not developing it in any number of other ways, not developing it as housing estates, as entertainment centres, as business centres, as transport hubs, as schools, or even as hospitals, which might deliver other social, economic and health benefits. But green spaces are vital because they deliver different benefits relative to these other uses of urban space. So for me, protecting the future of green spaces, at least as our research at Leeds has understood it, has rested on kind of maintaining and sustaining a claim to the differential benefits that green spaces provide in, I suppose, what is a really uniquely challenging context where, you know, the financial pressure are extremely tight and pressure on land is immense.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. I'd like to loop Gillian in there, if that's okay, Gillian, to respond to and offer your opinion around that question.
Yeah, and I'm delighted to say if I'm in control of the mute, I can unmute myself, so that helps. I would say I completely agree with what Anna's saying, but also from a council perspective, and I'm going to speak from a Scottish perspective, not a UK. You need to recognise that there are different legal regulations at play in all four parts of the UK. So in Scotland, we have a statutory duty to produce an open space strategy that talks about the quantity, quality and accessibility. That's a planning duty, it's not a parks duty, and it covers all open space, whether private or public, so we really don't care who owns it. We also have a duty to do a forest and woodland strategy, and we now have this duty under planning to do this place efficiency assessment. All great, all going in the right direction. But if I look at budgets, and I also look at how budgets are coming from the UK government, the impact assessment on levelling up is based on an economic argument about how many houses you can build and how much industry. It puts a nil or a zero or a negative value on anything that is green. It doesn't carbon account, it doesn't do anything. If I look at budgets of a council, they can work out how much money to spend on social work and on a social work building, but a park is seen as a negative equity that's nice to have and a drain. Even if that park makes our young people better learners, more healthy, it improves people's mental health and well-being, it reduces drug prescription for depression, it makes people more employable. All of that I can do with open space and good quality open space, but I cannot scrape the money from the social work budget, the national health budget, and I can't take it from the education budget. Yet education are being told to put children outside to do outdoor play and outdoor learning in high quality spaces, but they don't pay me to do that. So there is a real juxtaposition. We're getting more pressure on our open spaces because of the carbon and the net zero. So they want open spaces as carbon sinks to lock the carbon up. They want us to plant more trees. If you look at our vacant and derelict land, if you look at us doing an order of where our quality open spaces are in Scotland, we're trying to do a high quality open space within 400 real walking distance of everybody. Whose quality? Because the affluent know to ask for the moon, the less affluent just want, as Dan said, the dog turd not to be there and to have a nice path. They don't know to ask for the moon and negotiators down. And if we are going to put more high quality spaces in, I'm facing arguments about people saying, well, which one are you going to let go? If you're going to put a new open space there, how do we manage it and maintain it? And there are competing demands for it to be used as flood alleviation, for tree planting, for house building, for industry, for education. Now, from a council point of view, you can build those things, but I want you to provide open space at the same time, and I want you to provide it, and it can be on the roof of the building. I really don't care. It can be on the side, as long as it's usable open space that people can do things with. The issue we then find is who maintains, and are the communities resilient enough to maintain it, to stewardship it, to keep it going? Do they have the trust from the council to do that? And do they trust us not to screw up what they are doing? And are we having a proper conversation about them, about how they maintain that land? So just to kind of round up, we're trying to do some digital tools. So we're trying to do digital twin models and dashboards of our open space and our forest and woodland, so that people can see what quality those spaces are and can look at that data. And we can use that data to ask the map. So I start saying to people, there's no good just saying I want that bit of land and that bit of land, because there's competing issues about that, and we need a quality geospatial evidence base to say who's going to give us the biggest return for that land. And you need to look at the health and well-being, the social cohesion, the environment, the economic and the biodiversity, all at the same time, all in the land. And I do tend to say to people that your bricks and mortar infrastructure is actually a nature-based solution if you look at it properly and understand the impact you're going to make on the community, the health and well-being, the environment, biodiversity and economy all at the same time, and you adapt, not mitigate. So you adapt your development to provide a good quality open space around it, on it, up it, on the sides of it, within the courtyard of it or whatever, and you open that up. So the Southern General, when it morphed into the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, has a children's play area and a kickabout area, and we insisted they didn't fence them off so that the local kids that lived near to the hospital could come and enjoy those spaces equally as well as the kids that were being brought down to the National Children's Hospital.
That's great, Julie. Thank you very much for that. John, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to shift just forward in the questions here around this importance area that we're looking at, shift it forward to the environment. And so this next question for you, how does investment in urban green spaces mitigate against the environmental threats? For example, flooding and water quality, reducing air pollution and urban temperature regulation. So keen to hear your thoughts around that.
Right, I think so my focus is trees, okay, but the power that we've got in something like trees, that's a phenomenal piece of sort of bioengineering. Nature does all the jobs that we try and engineer solutions to in such a far more effective way. So a tree will effectively cools all the air around us because it pulls the water up from the ground, and the process of photosynthesis sucks the energy, the sun's energy, and helps us do that carbon dioxide conversion, pulls the carbon dioxide out. The bit that we benefit from within our urban area is that cooling process. So that's huge when it comes to the not just the environment, but the benefits to health. Heat mitigation is one of the big ones that our green infrastructure can give us, and especially trees, and especially mature, fully grown trees. They've got an immense role to play. And there are parts of, I think, Lyon in France, where they have now taken to watering the trees in order to trigger that process during the heat waves. In order to, rather than just spraying, if you remember when you might go on holiday, they spray the air with water in front of the shops. That works, but it's nowhere near as effective as actually letting the tree do the work, because it pulls the energy out of the heat out of the air. So that's one route. The other, in terms of a large canopy tree, it will capture the water. It either, if it goes into the ground, it will sort of use it and take it away. But the half of the water that comes down in those it sits in the leaves and never hits the ground, and it goes back up again. It will evaporate straight from the leaves of the trees. That means it doesn't hit the ground. It doesn't hit those hard concrete impermeable surfaces we've got, and therefore we have less stormwater runoff. We have less likelihood of flash floods. And if you look at the climate change projections for where we are going to end up in this country on the current trajectory, we're going to see more sort of heavy duty rainfalls, more sort of short and sharp heat waves are part of the more erratic weather systems we're likely to encounter in the future. And something as simple as using trees can help mitigate those factors going forward. Can I just touch on some of the previous conversation that's going on? I agree with Gina. I like your sort of definition of open space is almost literally anything that is an open space. I could stand in the middle and go, this is an open space. For me, that's part of the challenge, not to go, here's a park, a thing we've called a park. It's here's a place where we exist and we move, and those are the things we need to green. And I will come back to trees. One of the beautiful things about a tree is that at ground level, it might occupy something that's about 1 meter square. Up there, it can be 10, 15 meters wide, both directions. It's an extra layer up. Our green infrastructure for trees can exist up there, and we can still use We can still park our car underneath it. We can still walk underneath it. We can still have our playgrounds underneath it. Trees have an incredible role to play to produce that extra layer above for our green infrastructure.
Absolutely, thanks, John. And Dan, just lastly, before we move to the barriers, yeah, if you could just get your thoughts on that question too.
For me, there's something, I mean, just bouncing off it, I completely agree that we need to think about space more holistically as a whole. I was involved in a project in Hackney with Friends of the Earth where we're looking at having a postcode gardener, and the challenge was to try and fund someone for less than Netflix prices per person to do community gardening on a street. And a key idea behind that was that they weren't going to garden necessarily your house. It's which of the houses where the wildlife or culture or society would benefit most if those houses had some benefit from being gardened a bit better, because they are also part of public space and they also provide value in all kinds of different ways. And certainly the way that a lot of government in England works and a lot of charities work is dividing things up according to the private land, the public land, and on the whole not working into each other's spaces, which if you're trying to create a hedgehog corridor or have more butterflies or children to play makes absolutely no sense at all. And so some of these constructs we have in society around how we organize urban areas does not fit with ecology or the way in which people work. And just thinking about those green spaces as well and spaces in general, a couple of observations, I guess an observation and an insight. One is if you get a train through a city and you look in people's back gardens, then you'll see that there's incredible cultural and ecological diversity through the gardens. And what you'll see in the urban parklands on the whole is very, very homogeneous space that is not nearly as diverse in all kinds of ways. And when I think of somewhere like Clapham Common compared to Dalston Curve Garden in Hackney is an old bit of railway that's completely constantly under threat of development. And they have a mini theatre, they have food growing for children because there's no other green spaces going to locally. They have a cafe, they do classes, they do art, they do everything. And like what can only be something like 50 or maybe 100 square meters or something absolutely tiny. And yet these big expansive parks are just completely doing nothing. And I think we need to question like what are the cultural dynamics that mean that for some reason when there's a fight at play, British people create multifunctional, super exciting spaces that people want to engage with. And yet quite often when the authorities look after these spaces, they become semi-devoid of life and only certain activities are allowed. And so just a quick insight to finish on, which was I've often thought that people think of childhoods as a period of time, but as a geographer, I like to think of a childhood as being a bit more like a neighborhood. And so begin to imagine like what would you want in a child's childhood as in a place? Well, then you want them to have safe freedom and access to all kinds of assets, including fantastic trees to climb. I think walnut trees are my favorite tree to climb, going right through to all kinds of other things you might think you might want to have in a childhood. And as a geospatial provocation, I think it'd be amazing to give every child throughout their life, through their parents, a big mail merge that gives them a map of their local area that shows what's available within their childhood, and do that not only so people can find what's in their childhood, but as a political provocation to say, well, why are certain childhoods absent of the things we would expect every child to have access to? And clearly you could do the same thing for an 80-year-old as well, right? So I think thinking geographically about what's inside our neighborhoods or areas and what are the barriers to accessing those things, it's really important in this conversation.
That's great. Thank you very much, everyone. It's okay. Going to shimmy now through to the next pillar that we're talking about around barriers, and this one around specifically around accessibility. So again, I'm going to come to you first, Anna, for your insights around this question. So given the disparities in terms of access to urban green space, what kind of barriers are in place that prevent or limit engagement with the spaces? For example, physical, social, or cultural. In other words, what does everyone use urban green space? Does everyone use urban green spaces in the same way, and does everyone benefit equally from your research that you've done? We'd love to hear your insights.
Yeah, so quick answer, no, but I think there's been quite a lot of focus in recent years on spatial inequalities to urban green space, and the idea that green space is obviously, like other social assets, is unequally distributed across local areas, right? And so the green infrastructure framework is seeking to essentially increase the amount of green space and thereby doing so, hopefully reduce those kind of spatial inequalities that people have. So in terms of the kind of move to kind of more compact neighbourhoods and having accessible spaces locally, that will do something in that regard. But I think in terms of women and girls' access to parks, obviously that would improve their having equal access to local space would improve their access to space. I think gendered accessibility actually goes beyond kind of travel time to parks or equal distribution of those spaces. So obviously the Monitor for Engagement with the Natural Environment has shown that essentially those who that engagement is often lower amongst those who could benefit the most, and this includes women, but obviously there's lots of intersectional barriers that are faced by people who are older, who are the disabled, people from ethnic minority communities, those who lived in deprived areas and so forth, and these kind of might overlap and interact to form more kind of complex inequalities and barriers to access. But for women and girls, our research has found that essentially feelings of safety and concerns about safety in park spaces are one of the things that create a barrier to using parks and green spaces. So whilst we envisage kind of parks and green spaces as being free to enter, that they're available to everyone, that often they're not gated or locked at night anymore. So in theory that they're kind of accessible to everyone at all times. Our kind of research argues that because they don't necessarily feel safe and there are gender disparities there, then they are not accessible to all. So if we look at the high level data on that, the Office of National Statistics have shown that parks are places where women feel less safe in compared to being on public transport, in residential streets, in high streets and busy public spaces. So there is a difference in perceptions of safety across different types of public spaces, and parks stand out as that. So we're not saying that they're inherently more unsafe than other public spaces, which creates a barrier. But what we're kind of saying is that more work needs to be done here, and women are 3 times less likely than men to feel safe in parks during the day, and 4 out of 5 women in Britain feel unsafe using parks after dark. So if we think about a country where it can get dark at 3 p.m. In the afternoons, where 6 out of the 12 months of the year are dark, this is quite a significant barrier and restriction on using public spaces. So we've interviewed women and girls to find out what would make parks feel safer and more welcoming spaces. And lighting does come up as an issue, which obviously we need to address in terms of the wider issues to biodiversity and wildlife and effects on residents and wider things. But, lighting was seen as one of these things that would allow women and girls maybe to walk home after school or work on a winter's afternoon, to go and walk your dog, for instance, interviewing a nurse who would go and walk their dog in the morning before work and it's dark, or where parks are kind of these spaces which are kind of significant cut-through places, so that women are limiting their opportunities to use exercise places across the other side of parks, or to get to work opportunities where parks are kind of in between these spaces. So lighting is kind of part of, I think, the discussion around this, but lighting and other types of interventions don't deal with some of the core issues, which is the societal kind of challenges and barriers that kind of underpin harassment and violence against women. So the kind of experiences of harassment that women are facing on a routine basis are part of our kind of safety concerns, which is kind of broader than crime. And girls are starting to experience harassment at very young ages. Nearly 80% of girls experience harassment before the age of 16, which is significantly impacting on their perceptions of safety in these spaces. So for girls and women, a lot of them have talked about designing parks that are more open and visible, in particular along kind of main paths and in kind of core parts of the park, which I think we need to manage with other concerns. And for teenage girls, there was a really strong feeling of entrapment. So this is about facilitating escape, thinking about parks. I mean, I hate to kind of raise all these kind of barriers. We're talking about high quality spaces, but also their concerns are thinking about escape from these spaces, which is actually, you know, quite challenging when we're talking about, you know, building dens in forests and climbing trees and stuff. You know, our girls were bringing to, well, how can we escape from some of these spaces if we need to? So the kind of high fences on some of the kind of provision for teenagers in parks were seen as challenging. And I think what this kind of speaks to is a lot actually that we need to be designing parks with and for girls a lot more of the time. And so girls were prioritising things around making parks better for them, around sociability, things like age-appropriate swings, things like circular social seating, hammocks, informal play spaces, performance spaces. So a lot of the provision in parks doesn't actually meet teenage girls' needs, which is some of the work around Make Space for Girls are doing. So kind of raising, you know, the things that actually appeal to and the needs of these different communities is really important. And it's great to hear, Gillian, that there's planning there with youth in order to engage those in place efficiency strategies, because I think that will go a lot of the way to actually making these spaces work better for them. I mean, women have different views on safety in parks, but what they do agree is that seeing other women, this is the most important kind of finding for them, that seeing other women in parks is a sign of safety. So we need to activate spaces and make them spaces where women want to be and make them well used spaces.
That's great, thank you, Anna. I'm going to move over to Gillian, if just to give your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I would actually say I do the guides, and when in the pandemic, when we were allowed to move from online, we went into the park and I suddenly doubled my numbers because the girls wanted to be in the park, and then they were very, very visible. What I would say in the barriers, there's the what you might describe in Scotland as the I-beam. So parks are managed by a parks department, not by the planning service. So they have a process and they are risk averse. So we've tried to increase the amount of informal play, or we said this is what it's can, and it gets designed out because they're scared of being sued, because somebody's going to break a toe or chip a nail, or they're going to bruise their knee. And when I played, that was what you did, and if you bruised your knee, you learned, and it was a good learning experience. And I can remember playing where there was concrete under the climbing plane. I'm that old. We now make things safer, but there is still a perception within parks management that, and the councils are still risk averse. And I think some of the change in legislation in Scotland is trying to change that to make it risk aware. The place efficiency assessment is challenging us to ask the under 18s and all of them how they play, where they skip, jump, run, get muddy or whatever. I had a conversation with a parks development lead who said, you'll need to rule out spaces. They can't comment on spaces. He wanted me to rule out cemeteries, and I told him to get lost in the politest possible way, because if a 16-year-old tells me that the safest place that they feel is to sit on the wall in a cemetery, then that's a valid open space for them. But there is a perception amongst the adults that there are spaces you can go and there are spaces you can't. And what we're being challenged to do in Scotland is design those spaces with the young people. If you look at barriers and you just calculate accessibility on distance, there's a park in Glasgow called Pollock Park, and I'm sure Dan knows about it. Amazing park, donated to the city over 100 years ago, now got the Burrell collection in it because the air pollution dropped enough that you could put that in. The Pollock housing estate, so the social housing, is cut off from that park by the M74. The entrance into it is through a narrow dark tunnel through a bit of ground that doesn't look welcoming. You would never let an 8-year-old cycle into that. They've got to cross a dual carriageway to get to that. Whereas if you live in the affluent Shawlands on the east side, you have good ways of getting in. You would quite happily let your 8-year-old run away from you in that side of the park. It's the same park, it's just not valued. We also have territorial. So in cities like Glasgow, probably in Belfast, there's probably some of this in London. There are spaces and places where if you are of a certain gender or a certain religion or a certain persuasion, you cannot go. It is not your space. You are not allowed to go in it. It doesn't matter how well you light it or how well you design it. The other one, very quickly, we have government throwing money at parks development or other things. They're not waiting for the strategies. So we've got an open space strategy. We're trying to get the quality data behind it. We've got to do a place efficiency assessment. It only became regs yesterday. But Scottish Government are already throwing £1 million or £20 million or whatever at councils to do parks, improve play. They're not waiting for the kids to tell them what they like. The councils are going to scramble for money because they've got budget. They're going to improve play spaces with inappropriate material, inappropriate kit that the kids don't want, or the kids don't even live in that space, because they might improve a toddler's play area, but the kids are now 16 and want something completely different. We don't adapt, we don't move, we don't recognise that some places will become redundant for one use and need another use. We also think about sports as being formal sports, and that's what boys mainly play. Girls want to sit and do something else. If they see kids kicking a football or a football pitch, they think that's for the boys. There is a whole raft of gender issues. We're also getting new issues around the immigration, so the communities that are coming in that we're welcoming. Think about spaces in different ways. So there's a hidden garden in Glasgow. It had to be designed so that the women from a religious group could sit there with their kids without being seen by men. Now that gives you a whole different way that you're designing spaces. You've got to hide the women, not show them. That goes completely against what I would think. But there is a whole load of, we're not designing those places with the people. We're not adapting them as we go for the climatic changes, for the age of the population, the people that live there. And the reason why the spaces Dan described, the intervention ones, the meanwhile spaces, whatever work, is because nobody's laying down a set of parameters about what a park should look like, what an open space should look like. They're inventing it as they go. There is a movement to try and make communities more resilient and give parks to communities to manage, but you've got to make sure the community are resilient, they know what they are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and that nobody's going to come along and screw up what they've already done. And they get an attachment to a space. So those meanwhile spaces, we've done some of them in Glasgow, sometimes destroy the resilience of the community, because even though they've signed a lease that says the developer can come along and develop this, when the developer comes, that destroys their confidence, because they don't have the confidence to lift everything up and go and do it on another space 50 metres down the road. They think they've been given a space and that's their space infinitum, and that's not the way things work. So there's a whole load of issues there that need to be kind of pulled together. I would love for funding to come from government where they say, we've got funding, we are now going to work with the councils and the communities and groups like Dan and work out what needs to be done at that place, and then we're going to line up the money. What we have is square peg and round hole financing. They come up with an idea, we need to improve play, right, we'll throw money at play. They're not waiting for the evidence, they're not waiting for the community to tell them what to do.
I mean, I'd like to move John in there to get your thoughts on this area too, John.
Yeah, that was fascinating. In terms of barriers for me, I was just going to throw one in terms of the decision-making fabric by which decisions are often taken within local government. Ultimately, it will go up to the senior decision-making body, which is the council, and these are elected representatives who are representing a ward. And a lot of information is then split out by ward. Carried out a project for one of the London boroughs, and we were developing or working through a concept. It's known as tree equity, which has been a lot of work done out in the States. In simplistic terms, it's a measure of the extent to which people have access to trees and the benefits of trees. So you might live near trees, but if they're the other side of a wall, you don't get any of the benefits from them. So it's kind of a measure in there. And we mapped the canopy cover by ward, and sitting with a local tree officer, and he went, that's great, John, but see those two wards there? If I'm in the streets and look north, they're exactly the same as if I look south. But the one in the north, I can't plant there. I can't get any money for that because you're telling me it's got high canopy cover, which it does at ward level because there's a big woodland at the northern end, but those guys don't use that woodland. But I can't justify money in spending plant new trees there. So we had to redo the work and become much more sophisticated, and we ended up working at canopy cover over the streets. So where the streets where people spend their time is how we recalculated the figures and then compared them to the heat and the other pollution sort of challenges. And then we were able to get a model that felt like it fitted the experience of the people that are walking up and down those streets. So the very decision-making fabric we've got can mitigate against trying to solve some of those accessibility problems, because it happens to be the metric which we use gets twisted by some large green space within that ward. And then when you come down into the detail of some of those things, I was going to add in time is one of the things. So people are very time poor. We don't all have time to make a trip to a park if it's that way, and my life operates in that way. So we have to green the spaces that people actually use, not just produce new ones for them, because they may not have the ability to get to them. Hence, back to streets and planting trees within the streets that we actually use. And one of the big challenges there is the other uses that we've got for that space. And the thing that really gets my goat is the biggest thing we have that's a barrier to tree planting is cars. Not cars that are moving, cars that are still not being occupied, not being used. It's the most ridiculous wasted asset that we've got, is millions of cars parked, and they're parked in spaces where you could put a nice tree. And if we do it cleverly, we can put the trees and still have spaces to park our cars. But the urban infrastructure needs some new thinking about how we put those two things together. I was going to say, in terms of come back to the point about accessibility and decision-making frameworks, I think they're called the International Union of Conservation and Nature. They've adopted a model that was put forward by the professor of urban forestry, a guy called Cecil Conondike in University of British Columbia, but he calls it 330-300. So the simple idea is that everybody should be able to see 3 trees from where they live, from their own front door. They should experience 30% canopy in their local neighborhood, not in their ward or their town or their city, the bit that they live in. And they should then be, and then the last bit is 300 meters from a park or green open space. And that talks to all the various bits that we had right at the top about the access to nature and the benefits that we had. But I think that one of the challenges we've got is to find the information to allow us to make decisions that operates at neighborhood level, even street level, not just ward level or city level. And that will allow us to then solve the problems that people are genuinely experiencing on the ground.
That's great, John. Thanks. We're in a really nice flow here, just looking at the clock at 22 minutes past. I'm going to ask Dan to address that question, then we're going to shift on to just the final kind of closing remarks around kind of ideas around solutions. So Dan, yeah, if you'd just like to talk to that final barriers question, please.
Yeah, well, I'd like to blend together some of the barriers and solutions into sort of the same thing, maybe a little bit. I just agree with everything that everyone said so far, thinking about people's safety who come from marginalized backgrounds, which by the way is the majority of people are marginalized in one way or another. Think about how we're managing land. I mean, cars, what a massive problem. And the footprint of London has more space for cars than it does domestic residential buildings. I mean, how bonkers is that? And when I think about some of my favorite green spaces, actually, I mean, I would still like the trains to be there, but they're the abandoned railway lines, the linear parks that often go from rural places through the middle of cities, connecting different neighborhoods, great for wildlife, great for people. And just what a fantastic thing to think about, that if the policy was right, if the road space, half the road space, which is currently given over to car parking and given over to driving, was actually rethought of to become linear parks, completely inspired by the most successful linear routes we see going through our great cities, from Bristol to London to Aberdeen and so on. Big barrier for actually getting stuff done is this mix match. I mean, Gillian just talked about the problem of meanwhile spaces. I would like to see a Tinder created for land that basically allows people to swipe left or right on land, permission, finance and skills, so that the landowners, the skills people, the finance people can find each other. Because actually there are people who are in all those camps who want to find each other but don't know who they are, and there's definitely an opportunity for a clearinghouse there. Major bugbear for me during COVID in terms of barriers. I was living in Hanwell at the time. I live in Exeter now, but I was in London, and there were blocks of flats in some of the most deprived parts of London overlooking a massive expanse of green space, right? And this expanse of green space, I did some photoshopping, could have included Tooting Lido, Battersea Park tennis grounds, all of them, Burgess BMX track, Finsbury racetrack, the athletics track, Northallerton Hill, Regent's Park Open Theatre, Kew Gardens Palm House, and all of Hampstead swimming ponds. And this area of land is a golf course used by a minority of people in a central area of London. And London and many cities have these spaces which exclude the majority of people from using them. And I think if they were super multifunctional, actually could work far harder for people, and with more people in those spaces could be enjoyed more as well. And I think it's interesting to look at our colleagues in Japan and what they do with parks there, this point that Anna touches on in terms of activation, that they have people whose jobs it is to activate parks. And actually, if you have someone there to activate the park, that gives a purpose and a reason and a meaning for being there that brings people together, and also then creates a safer space for people to engage. Why don't we have a ministry for well-being that can properly fund parks, but also activate these spaces? Like, where is that? And why is it that when it comes to sport and well-being, that's divorced from our NHS in a way that it's not in other countries? Like, why are we putting those activities from a UK perspective alongside media and culture? It just doesn't make sense in terms of where the key benefits are. The final barrier I'll touch on for me as well is around signage, actually. And signage in terms of signage not being just, you know, this way to get to somewhere, about it being a cultural invitation to say that something is normal and okay. And what I would do if I was a mayor is I would look at every street in a city, and apart from a few rat runs, turn them all into play streets. Say, this is a family play street. This is what this place is for. If you're grumpy and you don't like children, then you need to go and have a bit of a rain check. This is what the purpose of these public open spaces are for, and prioritize children over cars. And what I do in the green spaces is, as well as saying, you know, you can't have a barbecue and please like clean up your dog poo, all those benefits that John and Gillian and Anna are aware of in terms of social, environmental, economic benefits, let's name them in their parks, so all the millions of people who are using in the parks understand the value of them, to build up the constituency of support for the policy and ideas that will help to provide the finances to better support them. I mean, you've got the ability within the people who look after parks to put that signage up. It's not super expensive, so why not actually communicate what those spaces are for, rather than, you know, just having the conversation with a small number of people on a call like this. So there's a wide range of things, but actually all those examples I just gave are also geospatial, because it's about mapping out where are the entrances to the parks, where is the land that can be shared, where are the best opportunities to do the activations. Every single bandstand in the country should either have a DJ playing music or have someone giving a TED talk or something every single day and weekend. I mean, what are we doing with those bits of infrastructure? And there's actually so much, I'm ranting, my last point is there's so much infrastructure that the Victorians gave us, and they got a lot wrong, but I think we can learn a lot from our ancestors in terms of what is intuitively right without even necessarily always having the evidence base.
Thank you so much, Dan. Really, really interesting. Some great thoughts there. We're kind of through to the fairly close to the close now, but I would like a closing remark from the other three panelists there, just around the solutions element. And it does have to be very brief, I'm afraid, just a minute or so each. But expanding on some of Dan's points there, really looking outside the box around, you know, the creation of innovative solutions and increasing the amount of accessibility to green spaces. Do you have any ideas around that, or thoughts that you'd like to throw into the mix as a closing remark? And I'll come to you first, Gillian, if I might.
That's fine. I think if people have heard me talk before, I take the Scottish thing of saying I'm talking about open space. I'm not talking about green, because it plays with what Dan's saying. The biggest open space in Glasgow is the River Clyde. The second biggest open space is our roads, footpaths and cycleway networks. And we should be reclaiming them as what they are. The grey space is an open space. It doesn't necessarily need to be completely green or blue. It can have a bit of both. You can do the tree planting on it. But if we continue to just talk about green space, we've got a problem. Now, that's a language and legislation thing. So in Scotland, legislation, we do an open space strategy, but the OS has the green space map that originated in Scotland from the work that we did to put on a map where all the open spaces are. It doesn't picture all it has the grey spaces, it has the blue bit, refers to it as a green space. So I would ask the OS to change it to the open space map, because then we can start reclaiming more of the open space and not go down a green cul-de-sac, because that's what annoys me the most. It's open space. It can be on the roof, it can be the balconies, it can be the courtyards, it can be the walls, it can be the reclaimed railway stuff, it can be a path beside the railway. It is not just green. That's the smallest bit that we have. It's the open space that we need. We need it to have clean air around it, lots of tree cover and shelter, and be multifunctional. So if you're going to build something, you're putting open space in. I don't care if you put it on the roof like they did in Copenhagen, you're suddenly well putting the open space in.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and Anna, to you for a final thought.
Yeah, I think a number of quick wins have actually been outlined throughout the talk, and we're hoping to bring some of those quick wins to you. So we're launching some guidance in May, which is bringing together the evidence around gendered accessibility and around some inspiring case studies, because I actually think that a lot of this, actually you can see some work that's going on the ground that will be inspirational, I think, to take some of these ideas forward. So quick wins, work at varying scales, and costs and budgets, but yeah, lots can be done.
That's great, thank you, Anna. And John, as a final thought from you, please.
Right, yeah, just one that, and it probably goes back to decision making, but talk about green infrastructure within urban spaces. I talk about myself working in urban forestry. That's trees, and it's also people, and you have to the people bit. It's not just about benefits for people, it's that they need to be involved in the decision making process. The consultation needs to happen, the communication about what's going on. And for me, we'd like to plant trees in this street. We're going to tell you about it first. So we'd like to get your opinions on how that might happen. And actually, would you look after the trees and can coordinate with your neighbours to look after those trees? Trees will last better in the areas where people care for them. Our green infrastructure as a whole lasts better if people are involved in the decision making, or which it comes about in the first place. So my last thought is we need to get better at the public engagement when we get involved in these things.
It's fantastic. Well, that draws us nicely to a close. It's been fascinating listening to you all. Thank you very much to the panelists, Anna, Dan, John and Gillian, for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees that have tuned in. We are recording the session. We're going to be putting on our Geovation YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you haven't managed to join or have a colleague or friends that you'd like to share the discussion with, please do that. Before we wrap up, I'm going to do a shameless plug here just for the next session, actually, which our positive impact panels continue next month, not next month, the month after next, 3rd of May, around digitalisation of the planning industry. So keep an eye on our socials for links through to that, if that's of interest to you. And finally, just a plug for our inaugural Geospatial Awards that we're launching at Geovation. So it's our first ever time we've done this. We've got links on our website through to that, and we'll share them in the chat, hopefully, too, for those interested. So really, we're seeking innovative applicants to the awards and those who are paving the way in innovating in geo in any way. There's 5 kind of broad areas that you can look at there. Places for nature, land, sea and air, resource equality, resilience, safety and protection of life, and then finally, individual contribution to open geospatial innovation, so looking at the open geo landscape. So that draws us to a close, and I'd just like to thank you all once again for joining us, and hopefully see you again soon. All the best. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye.